Bonjour. I want to present a case of historical ecology in the tropics. My example will be in the Guianas, particularly in the French Guiana, between along the coast between Orinoco and the Amazon. This presentation is mainly based on the study of earthworks during previous interdisciplinary research associating anthropology and earth sciences. First, is important to know that the multiplication of viewpoints open our mind on new results and new aspects of the landscapes. As I say, the French Guiana is located along the coast in Amazonia, between Orinoco and Amazonia and the Amazon River. The coast of the Guianas is a low plain, straight and kind of homogeneous landscape. Homogeneous at a first glance, but in reality, some very discrete anthropic traces can be found along this plane. The main aspect of this landscape, natural landscape, is the water. The water is very important in Amazonia. With most of the population must deal with an excess of water and try to use to their advantage water. Along the Amazon River, you have a flooding valley that is difficult to manage. So indigenous people did invent a special agriculture adapted to this flooding areas called várzea in Brazil. So they cultivate during the dry season, because during the rainy season you have the mud from the Andes is traveling along the Amazon, so they have very fertile soil along the river, so they can use it. The problem, obviously, is to go sufficiently rapidly to avoid the risk to lose all the plants. In the Guianas, the flooding plain is divided in two parts. Basically, in front of the sea, you have the young coastal plain that is a part, an area under the influence of the ocean, and behind this part we have swamps and especially marshes and that are cut by narrow and elongated sandy ridges parallel to the seashore that represent old beaches. You can see on this slide to the left this sandy formation that were used by a population to settle their village. They are representing this the growing of the coast between muddy banks and sandy beaches. So indigenous took advantage of this very particular landscape to settle the villages on these sandy ridges. You can see here a reconstitution of pre-Columbian settlement 1,000 years ago. Between this sandy formation, you have basically, as I said, swamps. Swamps that are difficult to for circulation. You have sometimes during the colonial times in Suriname, some soldiers went for expedition, and most of them died in this very difficult landscape. And in this landscape, which seems not very adapted for human condition, pre-Columbian Indians did build several thousands of rice fields that are small mounds along the marshes, between the marshes and the sandy formation. Basically, you have four main locations for these rice fields complexes. In the flooded areas, along the talwegs, along the slope, or in the entire flooded savanna. We can just have a look on one site to understand how this agricultural system was made. We are here near Kourou in French Guiana. You can see that the difference between the flooded area in blue and the dry area in green. Large rounded rice fields are found in the deepest part of the swamp. At the foot of the sand ridges, elongated rice fields follow the direction of the slope to allow easy drainage. And on the upper part of the ridge fields, the rice fields are laid perpendicular to the slope for optimal water retention. It seems that also that the Indians did scrape the fertile topsoils on the quaternary sand ridge to build these mounds. This implies a large labor force and perhaps planning under the authority of a leader. The map, we made map of these pre-Columbian rice fields, and they are really very important along the coast. Here you have a map of the spatial center in French Guiana, and just to have an idea of what we are looking at, this small rectangle is represent hundreds of these small rounded mounds. So we can have the idea that these mounds were cultivated intensively year after years, but studies on the rice fields, and especially in paleobotany, shown that in reality yucca, manioc, was not manioc esculenta was not the main staple, but maize was really important during pre-Columbian time. In fact, it was not a monoculture. We found many species in these rice fields, like maize, manioc, chili peppers, and beans, and squash, sweet potatoes, arrow leaf. Probably like 2 days, these rice fields were cultivated with a diversity of plants. So basically, the pre-Columbian landscape was constituted by these elongated villages along the sandy ridges, and to the south, the rice fields near the villages. Obviously, one of the most important questions would be to date rice fields. And during our program, we could have some answers, and making datings with the organic matters from paleo level under mounds that were dated between 1000 and 1300 AD, and these datings correspond to those of villages near these rice fields. We try also with some German colleagues to evaluate the erosion and bioperturbation rate using the residue of the nuclear test in the 50s, measuring the cesium-137 in the soil, and we can see a big activity on the mound where the cesium is important and deep because of a bioperturbation. At the foot of the mound, less bioperturbation because of the flooding each year, and on the matrice in the savanna without rice fields, few no perturbation and a few cesium because no bioactivity. So the erosion and the bioperturbation is quite different in the savanna built by in the mounds built by humans. An important bioperturbation is made by some animals, small animals like ants, and if we look at the mounds, we can see that they are maintained by different natural engineers like ants, plants, ants and termites, and worms that each of these animals and plants has a special action on these mounds. So the ecology of the mound is depending of many factors, between erosion and preservation, between animals and plants, and between natural events or anthropic events. To understand fully this coastal landscape, we have to take in account the interaction between human, ants, and plants. But this landscape, largely transformed by pre-Columbian Indians, continue after the conquest to be transformed by basically by European and colonial population. At the coastal savannas at the beginning were abandoned a while because the first settlers occupied islands and fled lowlands, convinced that the exhalation and deleterious miasm standing water caused putrid fevers. So in French Guiana, at least, a few colonial settlers did occupy during the first centuries these flooding areas. In Suriname, very soon the Dutch people made large polders along all the coastal plain, and very quick English people made the same in Guyana. They did use slaves to make huge canalization in this to dry some area to be cultivated by the polder system. In French Guiana, during a long time, the settlers did cultivate in dry inland and forested area, not directly in the savannas. The LIDAR techniques show some of these ranch that were cultivated under the forest. You can see here some small polders, between polders and agricultural beds under the forest. This is an interesting study made by the Regional Archaeological Service in French Guiana and students, where they could find the slave houses, the master house, and these agricultural beds under the vegetation. After the abolition of slavery, in French Guiana still had some slave, I would say, with the prisoner in French Guiana, but they didn't use them to cultivate the savannas, but basically to cut the forest. Some of them made some agricultural bed, but in very few part of the coasts. In the 20th century, most of the polders were closed, and the main techniques for to cultivate was the agricultural beds that are small mounds, not very elevated, and generally rectangular and sometimes very, very elongated. Most of the small and large and big farmers did use these techniques. We can see here in the savanna these small square that are these mounds, very flat mounds, cultivated by small farmers, Creole farmers. This Creole did work, modify also the savanna, making some ditches everywhere to protect their habitation from cattle and from flooding. They had a life, very difficult life, and it's a pity to see that the official history of French Guiana doesn't present these farmers that were dispersed in the savanna. So basically, the texts are absent, and only archaeology can show their life. Here you can see a structure to make the manioc, to cook the manioc, and the small houses were distributed in the savanna and with few structure. And today we have a renew of pre-Columbian agriculture thanks to Asian farmers who make some rice fields comparable to the Pre-Columbian race fields, but they are different. In fact, the Pre-Columbian race fields are larger and they are located in parts with more water. Here you can see the small modern Haitian race fields, and the Pre-Columbian race fields are larger and in a very wet area. These techniques from Haiti is very common in Haiti, and the origin of these techniques is absolutely not pre-Columbian, but very probably coming from Africa, where the raised field techniques is very common up to today, used in many countries of the Central Africa. In fact, the interest of such study is to make an history of a complete history of the landscape management through centuries. Here you can see the main periods of different management of these savannas, these flooded savannas, and the impact of these anthropic used. Basically, what we saw, it's a big difference between the coast, the flooding plain of the coast, and the rainforest inland. In the vegetation, the impact of Indians, pre-Columbian Indians, was not so strong in the coast, while in the forest, many studies show the strong impact of indigenous on the vegetation. In the same way, the impact on the soil by pre-Columbian Indians is not so strong on the coast. While in many parts of the rainforest, we found some terra preta with very dark anthropogenous soil. Morphology is probably more modified in the coast with thousands of race fields, while in the forest, in the rainforest, we found some ditches around the small elevation, but the impact on the morphology of the rainforest seems less than along the coast. In fact, the building of the landscape, the tropical landscape of the Amazon, is important because of pre-Columbian tropical agriculture, and the result that we can see today in the landscape comes from the interaction between humans, fauna, and vegetation flora. It's the interaction of the different beings, human and non-human, that produced the pictures that we have today of this landscape. Thank you.